must all stick together, and the clouds will soon roll by.
Welcome to the 14th episode of Always Remember, World War II through Veterans' Eyes. We must all stick together, shattering the Siegfried Line. The Siegfried Line, which spread from the Netherlands to Switzerland, was Nazi Germany's 400-mile western wall, a heavily fortified defensive line that took the Allies 6 months to pierce. David Saltman remembered the Siegfried Line as a formidable opponent in itself. Robert Maxwell regained consciousness after throwing himself on a grenade to save his buddies, only to find himself alone in an abandoned house. Maxwell found a lieutenant who helped him walk to a medic station. Along the way, his heel was blown off by another grenade. After having been pulled off the front line and sent back to regimental headquarters, Edward Rychnovsky regularly checked the piles of corpses brought in on trucks for men from his company. When Nicholas Oresko's platoon was ordered to make a third assault on a German position near the Siegfried Line, Oresko gave the order to attack, but no one in his platoon followed. Oresko decided to go by himself and took out 2 machine gun emplacements that were pinning down his men. Stan Davis's armored division took Trier, which had previously been thought impregnable. A seemingly peaceful apple orchard near the Sieg River proved deadly for Ralph Keller's company, which took devastating losses. Byron Whitmarsh's squad was engaged in a fierce firefight in and around a German cathedral. Furious that the Allies could use the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen as a bridgehead across the Rhine River, the German forces waged an intense 10-day battle to destroy the bridge with everything they had. Lloyd Huggins, Rex Whitehead, Byron Whitmarsh, Clarence Taylor, and Barney Zylka remembered the fighting at Remagen as one of the fiercest of the war. Those stories and more in this, the 14th episode of Always Remember World War II through Veterans' Eyes. During the 1990s, while serving as a teacher with the Department of Defense dependent schools in Bad Kreuznach, Germany, my family and I visited many of the sites associated with World War II, from the beaches of Normandy, where the D-Day landings took place, to the Ardennes forest, where the Battle of the Bulge was fought, to the death camps of Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Dachau. We saw what was at stake in World War II, when not only democracy in the U.S., but throughout the world, hung in the balance. I began to write to World War II veterans to thank them for their service. I sent them pictures of the sites we visited. I invited them to share their stories with me, and I promised to keep them alive in the classes I taught. What I never could have anticipated was that veterans shared their stories with their buddies and printed my letters and reunion newsletters. I was soon corresponding with approximately 140 World War II veterans, 20 of whom received the nation's highest honor, the Medal of Honor. I had more material than I could ever use in the classes I taught, so to keep my promise, I wrote Always Remember World War II through Veterans' Eyes and launched this series of podcasts, which are based upon the book. Believing Germany needed Lebensraum, or growing space, for the German race, Hitler began planning to expand Germany's borders early in the 1930s. Anticipating that the rest of Europe might not capitulate to his territorial demands, Hitler ordered the fortification of Germany's western borders with the Siegfried Line, also known as the Western Wall. Work began in secrecy on the Siegfried Line in 1936. By 1939, Germany's western border had been fortified with 22,000 bunkers, gun emplacements, trenches, tank traps, and barbed wire. In building the Siegfried Line, its chief architect, Fritz Todt, used an estimated 1 million pounds of steel and 8 million pounds of concrete. Neglected by the Germans after the success of their blitzkriegs at the start of the war, the Siegfried Line was reactivated after the Allied D-Day invasion. The line spread some 400 miles, bordering the northernmost reaches of the Netherlands, south through Belgium, Luxembourg, and France, before ending at the border of neutral Switzerland. At Germany's most vulnerable points, where attack was likeliest, the line was double fortified up to 18 miles wide. It took the Allies 6 months of fighting and nearly 250,000 casualties to shatter the Siegfried Line. David Saltman was liaison officer for the 638th Tank Destroyer Battalion, which was attached to the 84th Infantry Division. He was also appointed unit historian for his battalion. For Saltman, the Siegfried Line was a formidable opponent in and of itself, as he described in an essay he wrote at the time, a long short story. To my mind, the greatest thing about it is not so much the pillboxes, which were of massive strength and well built, but the elaborate preparation of plans for a fortified area. In other words, their accuracy was uncanny. They knew the ground, every doggone feet of it. They could put a mortar or artillery shell anywhere they wanted and score a hit on the first round. Their trenches were deep and well prepared. There is no doubt about how well the defense of this area was planned. The pillboxes were well camouflaged and reinforced with plenty of earth on their exterior. Every house had a good cellar, and that's where we lived, like a bunch of rats. Real estate was awfully scarce out here, too, and there was always somebody trying to find a place for a CP or a bullet. It was plenty rough and dirty. As liaison officer, Saltman spent most of his time at the infantry regimental headquarters. All command posts were in cellars because it was too cold to be outside and too dangerous to be anywhere on ground level, Saltman recalled. While at the German town of Geilenkirchen, in the heart of the Siegfried Line, Saltman recalled constant and unremitting shelling from German artillery and from the Luftwaffe. Never in any day of favorable flying weather did the Luftwaffe fail to appear, despite all the newspaper talk about where is the Luftwaffe, and when they appeared, they strafed. There was no doubt about that either. Near Besançon, France, on September 7, 1944, Robert D. Maxwell of Bend, Oregon, was one of just 4 soldiers with the 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry, 3rd Infantry Division, defending their battalion's observation post when it came under fierce fire at 2 a.m. Armed only with a .45 caliber automatic pistols, the 4 U.S. soldiers tried to hold off an enemy attack of platoon strength supported by 20mm flak and machine gun fire. The enemy had broken through the rifle companies and had nearly surrounded the battalion command post, Maxwell recalled in an October 26, 2000 letter. The order was given to withdraw from that position at about the same time the grenade landed at my feet. Maxwell immediately threw himself on the grenade, using his Army-issued blanket to absorb some of the grenade's deadly blast. When I regained consciousness, I was alone. I heard a sound inside the house, and I hobbled to the door. Lieutenant Edwin Johnson, our communication platoon leader, was removing the phone from the wire preparing to leave. Together we began our trek rearward. I was told later by some of my comrades that they thought I was dead. As Lieutenant Johnson and the severely injured Maxwell hobbled to the rear, a rifle grenade landed behind us, and we both received small fragments of grenade or gravel. Since most of my right heel was blasted away, I began to grumble that I couldn't walk any further. Fortunately, just then a jeep arrived and took the injured men to an aid station, which had been set up in a house about a mile to the rear. The medics stopped Maxwell's bleeding and gave him life-saving plasma. In the pitch-black aid station, Maxwell recalled one GI became panic-stricken as artillery shells roared overhead. I said, "Those are our shells going over," and he calmed down, Maxwell told the man, trying to reassure him. Only years later, I learned that was true. Those were our shells, but they were falling short, Maxwell recalled. After that, Maxwell wasn't able to recall much, just being evacuated from one hospital to the next, first to the U.S. General in Naples, Italy, then to Dibble General Hospital in Palo Alto, California, and finally to Camp Carson Convalescent Hospital in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Maxwell was hospitalized for 6 months until March 1945. 2 months later, on May 12, 1945, Robert Maxwell was presented with the Medal of Honor by Major General C.H. Danielson in Denver, Colorado. Edward Rychnovsky of Neillsville, Wisconsin, was a sergeant of a 50-man rifle platoon attached to the 5th Infantry Division when it was tasked with crossing the Moselle River in France. The Germans occupied the other bank of the river, and their machine gunners wreaked havoc on the platoon. On September 14, 1944, we crossed the Moselle in a town called Dornot, 20 miles south of Metz, France. About 500 men perished while trying to establish a bridgehead. We were then ordered to evacuate, and I was the last one out of there. Every man for himself was the orders. The river was harder to cross than it appeared. The mission had been to capture some forts, which were about 2,700 yards from the river. After abandoning the crossing at Dornot, the platoon later built a bridge at Corny, about 4 miles south of Dornot. Eventually, Rychnovsky was pulled off the front line and sent back to the regimental headquarters, 12 miles away. From there, he watched as every day dead American soldiers were brought back from the front line. The bodies were stacked on top of each other on trucks and unloaded upon arrival. Dutifully, Rychnovsky would take on the grim task of checking the piles of corpses to see if any of them belonged to his 5th Infantry Division. On his worst day, he found 16 of his former 50-man rifle platoon, all of whom had been machine-gunned to death as they slept in a gravel pit. No one was on guard duty, Rychnovsky recalled. They had all thought the war had ended. Rychnovsky estimated that of the 200 civilians who became soldiers in the 5th Infantry, no more than 20 made it to the finish line of VE Day. At the French border with Belgium, Henry Heller saw first-hand evidence of the terrible price the German army paid for Hitler's conquests. There were hundreds of dead Germans and horses. The enemy ran out of gas and had to use horse and buggy to get out of France. The stench was terrible. French people were digging trenches in the field and bulldozing the bodies and the horses together to avoid the ever-presence of disease from decaying bodies. Nicholas Oresko of Tenafly, New Jersey, had been shipped to the front with the rest of his platoon in 40x8 boxcars when the Battle of the Bulge began in December of 1944. Just before that, my platoon leader, an officer, was sent home on a 90-day rotation. As the platoon sergeant, I became acting platoon leader of 45 men. All of a sudden, I was in front leading. It was a real challenge, and I was scared. However, it all worked out. Late in the afternoon of January 23, 1945, Oresko's platoon was ordered to make a third assault on a German position near the Siegfried Line. The first 2 attacks had failed, even with the benefit of artillery cover. For Oresko's assault, there would be no artillery. It had already been spent. When Oresko gave the order to begin the attack, no one in his platoon moved. They still didn't budge when he repeated the order a second time. I said to myself, well, somebody has to go, so I decided to go myself, Oresko later recalled. As Oresko charged up the hill, his men slowly began to follow. The closest was 50 feet behind him, but they were soon cut off by Oresko from German mortar shells. I felt I would die, so I just kept going by instinct, Oresko explained in a 2000 letter. Oresko reached one of 2 machine gun emplacements and hurled his handheld grenades into it, destroying the guns. Oresko then shot its gunners before he himself was hit in the hip with bullets from a second machine gun, which was still firing on Oresko's now advancing troops. Presumed dead, Oresko began crawling towards his second machine gun. As he did so, Oresko's helmet tripped a booby trap, which exploded over his head. Realizing his remaining grenades had fallen out of his pocket, Oresko crawled back to find them, retracing his path through the snow. Having found his lost grenades, Oresko once again began crawling towards the second machine gun emplacement. Once there, he threw a single grenade into the machine gun's bunker, waited for the explosion, and then jumped in. 6 men had been defending the machine gun. 3 were killed by the blast of the grenade. Oresko finished the others with his rifle before he himself, badly wounded, finally collapsed. Because of Oresko's one-man assault, the Americans took sole possession of the hill that had twice defied them. In doing so, Oresko had eliminated 2 machine gun emplacements and killed 12 enemy soldiers. He was also gravely injured. "The wounds were serious to the right hip," Oresko recalled in a 2000 letter. "I happened to turn and the burst caught me across the hip rather than the stomach. Lucky." Oresko was evacuated to a hospital in Le Havre, France, where he performed limited duty as he recovered from his wounds. Oresko fully expected he would soon be returning to the front, so he was shocked when he was asked by an officer if he wanted to return home to the States by boat or by plane. At that point, Oresko suspected his actions near the Siegfried Line had resulted in his being presented with a Medal of Honor. Despite receiving the nation's highest military honor, and having been grateful that a successful assault allowed the hill to be taken with minimum American casualties, Oresko was always haunted by his actions that day. He later told New Jersey's The Record newspaper, "I think about that incident every day. It never leaves you. When you kill somebody, even though it's combat, you remember it, or it remembers you." Stan Davis recalled that the Germans had put up a real fight when the 10th Armored Division arrived in a small town just north of Heilbronn on April 2, 1945. The Germans were trying to get their troops across the river before blowing the bridge. The 10th itself was showing signs of wear and tear after 6 months of tough combat and not having received any replacements since about February 20th. As a result, we were about 50% below strength. Davis and his new lieutenant were sent up on the ridge across a town overlooking the river as a flank protection for our tanks. The lieutenant was hit in the head, and he was killed by a sniper. Later, Davis and the 10th Armored Division was with the 94th when it captured the historic German city of Trier. Davis recounted the taking of Trier in a 10th Armored Tiger Division Veterans Association newsletter. The morning after Trier had been entered by the 10th Armored Division and the 94th, Patton was handed 2 priority messages, one telling him to bypass Trier as it would take 4 divisions to capture the city. The other was from General Walker, reporting that the 10th and the 94th had just captured Trier. General Patton dictated an urgent telegram to the chief via 12th Armored Group Bradley's command. "Have taken Trier with 2 divisions. What do you want me to do? Give it back?" Davis and his crew went on to Kaiserslautern, Landau, Heilbronn, Heidelberg, before ending the war in Garmisch. 51 years to the day later, Ralph Keller recalled an intense firefight his outfit, Company A of the 387th Infantry Regiment, 97th Infantry Division, engaged in on April 8, 1945, as they were preparing an assault across the Sieg River, just south of Siegburg, Germany. Keller recalled the sun had just risen on a beautiful spring morning when his company, nearly 200 men strong, approached an apple orchard they had to cross on their way to the Sieg River. "As we started through the orchard, all hell broke loose from the left flank. German machine guns were hidden in an old house and a barn behind some trees. We never saw them." The machine guns were deafening, and Keller's buddies were falling all around him as he raced to the levee by the river. "The bullets were ripping up the ground all around me," Keller recalled. Why I never got hit still bugs me today." Suddenly, around the river's bend, Keller saw American rowboats floating towards them. While some of the men were grappling in the boats, my platoon set up mortars on the riverbank. We then commenced firing across the river. As soon as they could, Keller's company jumped into the rowboats that were hitting the bank. As we rowed across, we were under heavy fire, but still no hits. We were lucky again. Once across the river, the Germans seemed to disappear from Keller's company. "I guess they knew we had the upper hand," he wrote. But later that night, as they camped atop a hill among some huge trees, the pitch-dark night lit up with German mortar shells exploding as they hit the trees. Keller suspected German civilians must have told the nearby German soldiers that the Americans were camping there. "We were showered with spent shrapnel," Keller recalled. It was just another day in the life and death of an infantryman who could only hope the war would soon end. Byron Whitmarsh of Richardson, Texas, received a Silver Star for his actions on the morning of March 2, 1945, near Berheim, Germany. As with many soldiers, Whitmarsh received his commendation while recovering in the hospital from battlefield wounds. Whitmarsh was concerned that his Silver Star citation was not an accurate representation of what had happened. He wrote, "It appears that someone felt a need to embellish the story to make things sound more heroic." Whitmarsh's battalion was advancing in a column of twos on either side of the road leading to Fortuna, near Bergheim, Germany. Visibility was very poor because of fog. Because of the lack of visibility, the column moved into a line of Germans dug in along a brick wall. The brick wall was in front of a building where more Germans were thought to be hidden. As soon as both sides were aware of each other's presence, firing began. The leading squad leaders were killed immediately, and many others in the platoon were hit in the first blast. There was much confusion as the GIs took cover in the ditches and began firing at the Germans. Using a bazooka, one GI hit a self-propelled gun the Germans had dug into the right of the brick wall. As the Germans tried to escape the blast, they were shot and killed. Whitmarsh's lieutenant wanted him to take his squad through a hole in the brick wall to get into the building behind it from which the GIs were receiving fire. A German hidden in a foxhole between Whitmarsh and the wall presented a challenge. "I tried to hit him 2 or 3 times when he would bob his head up and down to see what was going on, but he never did try to get up to get a shot off, so it was not possible for me to hit him. I decided to try to throw a grenade in his hole twice, but I missed." While Whitmarsh played a cat-and-mouse game with the German in the foxhole, Captain Budinsky ran down the middle of the road, yelling something at the men in his company. Before Whitmarsh knew what the captain was yelling, Captain Budinsky was hit with a barrage of bullets, killing him instantly. Captain Budinsky fell just a few feet from Whitmarsh. Whitmarsh was now out of grenades. He started yelling for more grenades, and someone in his company gave him a white phosphorus grenade, which they said would get the German even if it didn't land directly in his foxhole. Whitmarsh's aim wasn't a whole lot better. This time the grenade landed in front of the foxhole. When it exploded, smoke covered a large radius around the hole. The lieutenant told Whitmarsh now was his moment to assault the German's foxhole. The lieutenant said, "Go get him now, Whit. He can't see you coming." I took off, but he had just gotten away before I got there, but the way was now clear to get to the wall. I waved to the squad to come and made it to the wall. When I looked through the hole at the milking stands, I could see a breath coming up over the curb in front of the stalls. So I got another grenade and I flipped it over the curb, and then we went through the wall. Having entered the dairy barn, Whitmarsh discovered his grenade had been deadly accurate this time and had resulted in the death of a large pig. We went into the right through the door in the milk room, which had a rack of milking machines and an electric cream separator in it, but no Germans. There was a door loading down into a basement opposite the door we entered. We threw a grenade down the stairs, and we shut the door. When Whitmarsh opened the basement door again, a German, disoriented from the blast, ran up the stairs with his hands up. Whitmarsh took him prisoner and sent him back to his lieutenant. Then Whitmarsh went down the basement steps. He found no one there, but he did spot an open cellar door leading out to the space between the milk room and the church. When Whitmarsh and his squad went up to the stairs to the church, they found another German soldier. He immediately threw down his rifle, and he held up his hands. He had a propaganda leaflet which promised safe passage through the American lines and good treatment with a warm, dry bed and 3 hot meals a day. Well, it sounded like a winner. Their new prisoner seemed willing to cooperate, so Whitmarsh sent a soldier back to ask the lieutenant if he could send over a German translator to question him. The soldier came back right away and said, "The lieutenant told him that we want S2 intelligence and to send the prisoner out and get the hell out of the building." Whitmarsh found an unlocked window, and he and the squad entered the church through the window, finding themselves in the sanctuary alongside the altar. The sanctuary was completely empty. The squad then went down a long hallway with classrooms, their rifles ready, knowing they had previously sustained enemy fire from the church. They found a staircase, and they heard noise from down below. Someone was coming up. The squad pointed their rifles, but lowered them when they saw that it was a priest carrying a white flag. He could speak English, and he said that all the Germans in the building were surrendering. The German soldiers were taken to the vestibule and told to pile up their weapons and sit down with their hands over their heads. The priest took me down to the big basement. There were some wounded soldiers in the corridor with German medics. There was a large lunchroom down there, which was filled with German civilians. The priest was told to tell everyone to stay where they were until the shelling stopped outside. The rest of the platoon, there was only 17 left, came in the building, and we began searching to make sure there were no more Germans in the building, and we found none. Later, some tanks came by, and we loaded onto them, and we moved on. Whitmarsh's Silver Star commendation said that he went outside and tended to the wounded, but Whitmarsh, a modest man, said that never happened. For Whitmarsh, it was just another long day in a long, long war. The Allied advance was undoubtedly sped up, and the war in Europe shortened by the unexpected capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. The Germans had tried to blow up the bridge with 6,200 pounds of explosives to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. But all the explosives failed to detonate, leaving the bridge damaged but still intact. The rapidly advancing 9th Armored Division captured the bridge on March 1st, 1945. Furious that the Allies could now establish a bridge across the Rhine River, the German forces fought an intense battle over the next 10 days to destroy the bridge using a vast array of weapons. The bridge fell under constant attack by 367 German Luftwaffe. In response, the Allies deployed the most anti-aircraft weaponry used in one battle in all of World War II. The 25,000 Allied troops who crossed the Ludendorff Bridge over the next 10 days witnessed the fiercest anti-aircraft artillery battles of the war. Lloyd Huggins was in the 60th Infantry Regiment, which became the 2nd Infantry Unit to cross the bridge at Remagen. "I remember crossing the bridge at a dead run. The Germans were firing everything within range, attempting to drop the bridge. We got over the bridge with only a few losses, and we pushed inland, only to be met by Tiger tanks. Without tank support, we were temporarily stopped. I remember seeing a machine gun crew set up and stop firing. In about 5 minutes, there was a whoosh bang, and the entire crew went up in an explosion from an 88mm shell fired by a Tiger." Huggins considered the flak from the firefights taking place in the sky above him every bit as dangerous as the enemy himself. The flak continued. And it caused almost as many casualties as the enemy. Troops on the reverse slopes of the hills had falling 50 caliber and 20 millimeter shells from guns protecting the bridge. They rained down like hail. Any of it would pierce like a fired bullet. If I sound a little bitter, I was. There were so many times when men died from friendly fire. Rex Whitehead of Logan, Utah, recalled crossing the bridge at midnight. The bridge was being shelled, and the traffic was crawling along. I was in a Jeep, and at one point there was a shell hole in the bridge. The engineers put 2 planks over the hole, and we drove on, very carefully. I have no idea how long it took, but of course it seemed like an hour. We were safe when we neared the east end due to the mountains and the railroad track which ran into the tunnel on that end. In addition to the Luftwaffe, the Germans used mines which either floated or were on boats, howitzers, mortars, and even V-2 German rockets. German underwater demolition teams were also deployed to the bridge, but they were discovered by the Americans. Whitehead recalled the searchlights that scoured the Rhine, searching for them. When crossing, there were strong searchlights upstream, which seemed downstream to me, and we found out they were there looking for men or boats floating down below the bridge, and there were some frogmen who were captured. The intense fighting made the bridge crossing an arduous, frightening experience. I was scared as I could get, but at the same time, I felt lucky to be crossing and not having to stay on the bridge under the shelling, as the engineers did. Of course, there were bodies on the bridge, and I assume they stayed there until they moved at daylight. Once they crossed the bridge, Whitehead's infantry company drove south parallel to the Rhine River. Whitehead's division had fought brutal battles, taking the German towns of Bad Honningen and Linz, and in the morning's light, the carnage was everywhere. When it became light and we went down the river and then turned left, there were more German bodies than I saw in one place than since the Bulge. There had been a hot firefight, and the bodies were still there in the road, being run over by the tanks and all, but since we were holding on to the bridgehead by our fingernails, there was not time for such items as body removal. As Whitehead's infantry division advanced along the steep hills of the Rhine, Whitehead appreciated his elevated view, which was a grandstand seat for the German fighters diving in to bomb the bridge or the bridges, for we had 2 pontoon bridges operating by then. The anti-aircraft fire was tick-shooting at the Germans, and a peril to us as it fell. When the German planes came up from their dive, they were jumped by our fighter planes, and there were some thrilling air fights and chases. I found it difficult to believe that I was witnessing such a show, but I felt that way about most of the war. The question kept coming to my mind, is this really happening to me? For Silver Star recipient Byron Whitmarsh, the bridge at Remagen was his most intense combat of the war. We moved to an area north of the bridge during the night of March 10th, 1945. The next morning, we joined a long column of units waiting to go across. We were in this column for hours before we approached the bridge. We moved along a street parallel to the river from the north. As we came closer to the bridge, it became more and more noisy. The Germans seemed to be throwing everything they had at the bridge and approaches. At times, the shelling was so bad that the traffic was stopped until wrecked vehicles could be pushed out of the way and casualties picked up. The Germans were flying almost continuously, trying to bomb the bridge, and the anti-aircraft filled the air with flak. They were able to shoot down some of the planes regularly.
This was an opportunity for me to see my first jet plane. The military police were directing traffic in the midst of all this. The medics had an aid station near the approach, and they picked up the wounded and the dead promptly, so as to keep the traffic moving as good as possible. When we got to the ridge, we started running as fast as we could go, and we kept running until we were clear off the bridge. I was afraid that we might get separated and lose part of our platoon, but it didn't happen. When we checked up, we had every one of our own, plus one extra from the 78th Division. He was with my squad for a couple of days after that.
Clarence Taylor recalled watching the fanatical German defense of the bridge from a 3-story building about a half-mile south of the bridge, close to the east bank of the Rhine.
It was from this building where we watched many planes shot down. Either they fell in the river or thereabout. One in particular fell directly in front of the building I spoke of. The German pilot came out of the wreckage, and we took him captive.
While watching the firefights take place in the skies above them, Taylor's radio section chief, John L. Steiner, was killed.
He was standing only 3 feet away from me, and a spent .50 caliber bullet from one of the planes fighting it out above us came down and struck him. He died instantly, practically in my arms.
Taylor had spent 8 months with Steiner, who he recalled as a short, thin man weighing only about 105 pounds. He remembered him fondly.
In our radio team, we called him John L. Sullivan, after the famous fighter, because he was always going into a fighting stance when friendly arguments arose. He was a good man, and we all thought a lot of him. After his death, I often wished I had been able to meet his parents and tell them how he died and how much we all loved him. I believe it would have meant a lot to them to know how much he was thought of. That's war. Things happen that you just can't control.
Barney Zylka recalled thousands of people crossing the bridge, tanks and cars, trucks and German civilians, one right after another. Zylka himself made several crossings of the bridge, driving civilians across in his scout car. Even after 50 years, he could recall the Ludendorff Bridge vividly.
Well, the bridge was just hanging there. The girders were crooked and bent and ready to fall apart. Down below, the Rhine River was going by like rapids.
Zylka recalled keeping a wary eye on the towers which stood on either side of the bridge. Initially, they had been occupied by German machine gunners, but now they were vacant. When Zylka crossed, German planes were still trying to bomb the bridge. The Ludendorff Bridge finally collapsed on March 17, 1945. When it did, 28 American engineers were killed and 63 others were wounded. By that time, the American engineers were already operating additional pontoon bridges that they had erected across the Rhine. Zylka crossed one last time the day after the Ludendorff's collapse, driving another officer across one of the pontoon bridges.
You could see where the bridge had caved in. It was just lying there in the water,
Zylka said. The unexpected taking of the bridge at Remagen enabled the Allies to move 5 divisions across the Rhine into the industrial Ruhr pocket, bordered by the Ruhr, Rhine, and Lippe rivers. Our song today, We Must All Stick Together, by Billy Cotton and his band, was recorded in 1939 and was a popular anthem in Britain, where it sought to unite all the different people in different social economic classes in the war effort. If you like this podcast of Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes, please leave us a review on whatever podcast network you use. Follow our podcasts and tell your friends. New episodes come out bi-weekly. You can find the companion book on Amazon.com. You should also check out our website for pictures of many of the veterans that are discussed in this episode. Until next time, thank you for remembering our World War II veterans.